March 14, 1847. The air was thick with the first hints of spring in the lowlands of Charleston County. Mist clung to the cypress trees lining the marshes, and the faint smell of damp earth mixed with smoke from distant hearths. It was the sort of morning that made ordinary tasks feel heavy, as if the day itself was reluctant to begin. In one of the scattered settlements near the plantation roads, an event unfolded that would shock neighbors and authorities alike, leaving questions that would linger for decades. At the center of the incident was a young woman, a slave known as Mariah. She was described by those who knew her as unusually robust for her age, her frame strong yet lithe in a way that suggested years of labor had hardened her limbs but not broken her spirit. She moved with a quiet confidence, her eyes carrying a mixture of caution and unspoken intelligence. To the few who interacted with her daily, other field hands, a caretaker, or passing neighbors, she appeared diligent, even obedient, a worker in the shadows of the plantation economy. The other key figure was a man named Elias, a runaway who had managed to evade capture for months. Rumors about his past were murky. Some said he had been sold away from his family at a young age. Others claimed he had witnessed brutal punishments that left him wary of authority. Unlike Mariah, Elias was slender, almost wiry, with a sharp gaze that seemed to measure the world in cautious increments. Where Mariah was grounded, Elias was restless, always calculating escape routes and hiding places. The morning of the incident began quietly. Mariah had been sent with a small load of supplies to a distant cabin on the outskirts of the plantation's lands. Elias, already on the run, had been moving silently along the edges of the woods, avoiding roads and paths. It is unclear whether their meeting was intentional or a chance convergence, but accounts suggest they encountered one another in a narrow clearing flanked by towering oaks and thorned underbrush. Soon after, 12 slave hunters, men employed by various plantations and bounty networks, spotted the pair. Each hunter carried the standard tools of the trade, whips, pistols, and ropes, along with the experience that came from years of tracking and capturing escapees. Witnesses later recalled seeing the hunters fan out, forming a rough perimeter that left little room for escape. The chase began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with the hunters' boots pressing into soft earth, leaves crunching underfoot. Then it accelerated, as Mariah and Elias realized the perimeter tightening around them. The pursuit stretched over miles, across muddy paths and shallow creeks. Mariah's strength allowed her to carry supplies while keeping pace, while Elias' agility and knowledge of the terrain guided them through hidden passages. Yet the hunters' numbers provided them a tactical advantage. One witness, a neighbor who had been tending his livestock, remembered hearing the shouts from a distance. "There, don't let them escape." The sound was sudden, harsh, and terrifying, cutting through the morning mist. As the chase continued, the pair moved closer to a marshland known to locals as Widow's Hollow, a place where the ground was treacherous, and the fog could swallow a person whole. The hunters, confident in their coordinated approach, began to split into groups, attempting to corner Mariah and Elias. At that moment, the tension between desperation and experience became evident. The hunters relied on training, brute force, and intimidation, while Mariah and Elias relied on instinct, knowledge of the land, and their shared will to survive. It was in this critical stretch that the first shocking revelation occurred, a detail that would haunt witnesses and investigators alike. One hunter, a man named Caldwell, slipped into a hidden pit while pursuing Elias, his leg trapped and twisted in a way that rendered him immobile. The hunters, initially unaware, only realized his absence minutes later, giving Mariah and Elias a fleeting opportunity to widen the gap. The marsh swallowed their footsteps, masking the direction they took. By late afternoon, the hunters were regrouping, voices strained and patience fraying. Their initial confidence had diminished. The chase had become unpredictable. Meanwhile, scattered eyewitness accounts began to emerge. A neighbor saw 2 figures darting across the creek. Another claimed to glimpse them disappearing into dense underbrush. Each sighting was fleeting, partial, leaving more questions than answers. And it was here, at the edge of Widow's Hollow, that the story shifted from a simple chase to a full-scale investigation. The remaining hunters began retracing steps, attempting to reconstruct the path of the pair, while plantation overseers sent word to authorities. What followed was a series of discoveries, some contradictory, some chilling, that would soon attract attention far beyond Charleston County. If you appreciate detailed investigations like this, you're watching Grave Case Files. Subscribe and join us for more real case deep dives. The remainder of the day was marked by confusion, missteps, and fragments of evidence. A dropped bundle of supplies, footprints in the soft mud, and a lone glove caught on a branch became central clues in understanding the elusive movements of Mariah and Elias. Yet despite these traces, the true trajectory of the pair remained shrouded in uncertainty. Every theory seemed plausible, and yet incomplete. How had they evaded 12 experienced hunters? Where had they vanished in a landscape so familiar to the pursuers? By late afternoon, the mist had thickened once more, curling along the edges of the swamp and giving the entire hollow an otherworldly quality. Shadows stretched unnaturally between gnarled cypress roots, and the air was heavy with the distant cries of birds startled by movement. The hunters, still disoriented from Caldwell's fall and the scattered terrain, began a meticulous search, moving methodically yet tensely, scanning every underbrush and depression. Witness accounts from nearby cabins were scarce but significant. One farmer, an elderly man named Whitaker, later recalled seeing two figures slip along the creek's edge. "They moved like the wind," he said in testimony to local authorities. "I swear for a moment they seemed to vanish into the fog itself." His statement, while poetic, was not entirely exaggeration. The marshland was notorious for its deceptive patches of quicksand, hidden ditches, and sudden pools of water that could mask footprints and obscure the movements of those fleeing. The hunters split into pairs, a strategy designed to cover more ground. Caldwell, injured, remained in a makeshift camp under guard while the remaining men continued the pursuit. They carried muskets, ropes, and knives, relying on the intimidation factor to flush the fugitives into open areas. Despite their experience, unease began to settle among them. There was a growing recognition that Mariah and Elias were not merely running, they were calculating, using the land itself as a shield. At approximately 3:15 p.m., one of the hunters, a man named Hargrove, stumbled across a partially hidden bundle of supplies. It contained scraps of clothing, a small satchel of provisions, and a knife, all unmistakably belonging to the pair. The discovery triggered a mixture of relief and frustration. Relief, because it confirmed the direction of travel. Frustration, because it suggested that Mariah and Elias were leaving deliberate misdirections, forcing the hunters to guess their next steps. By early evening, the pursuit had turned into a careful investigation of tracks, rather than a simple chase. The hunters followed footprints through thick mud, knotting irregularities, broken branches, flattened reeds, that indicated sudden changes in direction. Elias' agility and Mariah's strength were evident in these traces. Footprints shifted erratically, as if designed to confuse the trackers. One observer noted the pair seemed to have anticipated the hunters' tactics, a chilling thought for men confident in their ability to control the enslaved population. Meanwhile, word of the chase spread to nearby plantations. Overseers and local magistrates began coordinating, sending runners to alert neighboring settlements. Reports suggest that by dusk, nearly 20 additional men had been recruited to the hunt, armed with torches and lanterns, ready to comb the hollow under the cover of darkness. It was here that the first serious disagreements among the hunters emerged. Some advocated for a direct approach, forging into the densest parts of the swamp. Others argued for patience, fearing that rash movements could lead to more accidents like Caldwell's fall. Night fell slowly, bringing with it an oppressive quiet that amplified the tension. Mariah and Elias, as far as the observers could reconstruct, had reached a small embankment bordering the deeper swamps. The area was infamous among locals for sudden sinkholes and unstable ground. Footprints suggested that they had paused here, possibly resting or planning their next move. The hunters, moving cautiously with lanterns casting narrow beams of light, reported hearing only occasional splashes and muffled noises, signs that the fugitives were keeping to shallow water or soft mud, avoiding the open paths. An interesting development occurred when a local woman, Margaret Linscott, reported hearing voices near her property. She described the tone as urgent but restrained, not the shouting one would expect from captives in panic. Investigators later theorized that Mariah and Elias may have been communicating quietly, coordinating movements to exploit gaps in the hunters' coverage. This insight suggested a level of sophistication and forethought that complicated the narrative. These were not impulsive escapees. They were strategists navigating a life-or-death scenario. Around midnight, the hunters regrouped to discuss findings. They had collected partial evidence, discarded supplies, broken branches, and mudded footprints, but no direct confrontation had occurred. Discrepancies in eyewitness accounts began to emerge. Some claimed to have seen two figures moving north, others insisted the trail led west. The environment itself complicated matters. Heavy fog, unpredictable marsh paths, and nocturnal sounds created illusions, leading even experienced hunters to second-guess their perceptions. It was during this tense deliberation that one young tracker, Thomas Greer, raised an unsettling possibility. What if they're not running linearly, he suggested. What if they're looping, watching us, guiding us away from the true path? The idea, while initially dismissed, soon gained credibility as no further direct sightings occurred despite hours of careful tracking. For the first time, the hunters confronted the reality that Mariah and Elias might be manipulating the pursuit, controlling it from within the landscape itself. As dawn approached, investigators would later note the profound psychological impact of this chase. 12 experienced men, confident in their physical and tactical superiority, found themselves uncertain, exhausted, and increasingly aware of a vulnerability they rarely faced. Mariah and Elias had become ghost-like figures, their presence known only through traces and indirect evidence, yet their influence over the hunters' movements was undeniable. It was at this moment, just as the first pale light of morning began to illuminate the edges of the hollow, that the most shocking discovery occurred. A small clearing revealed signs of a hastily constructed hideaway, a rudimentary shelter formed from branches, partially concealed by reeds and brush. Inside, remnants of a fire, footprints, and the faint scent of smoke confirmed that Mariah and Elias had spent the night there. Yet there were no bodies, no captures, only evidence of a fleeting presence, and the clear indication that the fugitives had deliberately chosen this location to confuse the hunters further. By mid-morning, the hunters had pieced together a tentative sequence of movement, but clarity remained elusive. Every trail led to more questions. Had Mariah and Elias split temporarily? Were they heading toward the river, deeper into the swamp, or circling back toward inhabited areas? It became clear that the pursuit had transformed into a complex investigation, testing the skills, patience, and judgment of everyone involved. By mid-morning, the fog had fully lifted, revealing the vast expanse of the swamp in all its deceptive complexity. Pools of stagnant water reflected the pale sky, while tangled roots and reeds created natural barriers, forcing hunters to move carefully and deliberately. What had begun as a simple pursuit was now a painstakingly methodical investigation, with men measuring every step, knotting every broken twig or displaced patch of mud. The plantation overseers, growing increasingly anxious, dispatched word to Charleston authorities. By late morning, a small detachment of local constables arrived, bringing formal investigative procedures into the pursuit. The introduction of official law enforcement shifted the dynamic. The hunters, previously reliant solely on instinct and experience, now faced scrutiny, documentation, and the pressure of accountable reporting. Every observation, every footprint, and every discarded item would be recorded and analyzed. One of the first findings noted by the constables was the deliberate use of terrain by Mariah and Elias. In multiple locations, footprints appeared to lead toward dead ends, only for the fugitives to double back along hidden tracks. In one instance, a narrow path along a creek bank showed evidence of a hurried crossing, yet careful inspection revealed a secondary, less obvious route, partially submerged in water, that avoided detection entirely. This pattern suggested not only intimate knowledge of the land, but a strategic mindset designed to exploit the hunters' assumptions. Witnesses began providing fragmented reports that painted a picture of escalating tension. An elderly woodsman who had been gathering firewood near Widow's Hollow recalled hearing the faint sounds of struggle, a muffled cry, a snapping branch, but nothing conclusive. Another, a tenant farmer, claimed to have seen figures moving in tandem, almost synchronized, as if guided by a shared plan. These accounts, while inconsistent, pointed toward an extraordinary coordination between Mariah and Elias, raising questions about their prior interactions and the level of trust between them. By mid-afternoon, the pursuit took a dangerous turn. One of the hunters, a man named Burton, attempted to flank the fugitives by cutting across unstable terrain. A patch of mud gave way beneath his weight, plunging him knee-deep into a waterlogged trench. Though he escaped without major injury, the incident reinforced the hazards of the landscape and the increasing unpredictability of the chase. Observers later noted that every misstep by the hunters only widened the opportunity for Mariah and Elias to control the engagement. At approximately 4:30 p.m., the first direct evidence of the fugitives' resourcefulness emerged. A partially hidden cache was discovered beneath a fallen log, scraps of bread, a small knife, and remnants of cloth that matched descriptions provided by witnesses. Investigators noted the precision with which the items had been stashed, indicating forethought and an understanding of the hunters' likely search patterns. The placement of the cache suggested that Mariah and Elias were not simply fleeing. They were actively managing supplies, maintaining mobility, and preparing for extended concealment. Local authorities began formalizing the case. Notes were made, sketches of the terrain drafted, and interviews conducted with the hunters, overseers, and neighbors. Contradictions became evident. One hunter insisted the fugitives had moved north, another swore they headed east. The cache itself provided no directional clues, only proof of a temporary stop. These conflicting accounts slowed the investigation, forcing constables to cross-reference tracks, eyewitness statements, and environmental conditions. By early evening, the pursuit had taken on an almost psychological dimension. Investigators noted a pattern. Every time hunters believed they were closing in, the fugitives seemed to evade capture effortlessly, slipping into concealed areas or doubling back along trails the pursuers had already checked. A prevailing theory began to form, that Mariah and Elias were not merely surviving by chance, but were manipulating the hunters' expectations, turning the environment itself into an ally. As night fell, an additional layer of complexity arose. Observers reported strange disturbances, the distant sound of water being disturbed, fleeting shadows among the reeds, and occasional glimpses of two figures moving against the moonlight. These phenomena, though ambiguous, were documented as part of the case. Some hunters suggested the fugitives had split, using decoys to mislead trackers. Others argued the movements were consistent with a single pair employing sophisticated evasion tactics. The ambiguity only deepened the mystery. At the same time, tensions among the hunters reached a critical point. Caldwell, still recovering from his previous injury, argued for caution, warning against reckless movements. Others, frustrated by the elusive trail, advocated for aggressive pursuit, willing to risk personal injury for the chance of immediate capture. The debate revealed a fundamental conflict: experience versus intuition, patience versus force. This internal division would shape the subsequent phase of the investigation, influencing decisions that had long-term consequences. Around midnight, the investigation yielded a surprising discovery. A makeshift campfire was found deep in the marsh, carefully constructed within a natural depression to minimize visibility. Evidence indicated it had been recently used, and the remnants, charred wood, faint ashes, and disturbed soil, confirmed that Mariah and Elias had rested there. Constables surmised that the fugitives were not only aware of the hunters' pursuit, but were deliberately controlling their exposure, emerging only when conditions favored concealment. By the early hours of the following morning, authorities faced a sobering reality. Despite extensive efforts, 12 experienced hunters, supported by law enforcement and reinforced by local knowledge, had failed to make a direct capture. The fugitives' movements were coherent, deliberate, and highly adaptive, demonstrating an extraordinary combination of physical endurance, strategic thinking, and knowledge of the land. The case, once assumed to be a straightforward pursuit, had become a sophisticated and challenging investigation. By mid-morning of the second day, the marshland had taken on an almost oppressive stillness. The air was damp and heavy, carrying the scent of wet soil and decaying vegetation. Investigators noted that the environment itself seemed to conspire against them, with every step threatening to sink boots into mud, every shadow suggesting movement that might not exist. For those tracking Mariah and Elias, the line between caution and exhaustion blurred. Authorities expanded their search perimeter, coordinating with local plantation overseers to systematically comb areas that had been previously overlooked. Tracks were re-examined under brighter daylight. What initially appeared as straightforward paths now revealed subtle anomalies, footprints that shifted in depth, impressions that indicated sudden changes in pace, and areas where the fugitives had deliberately broken twigs to create misleading impressions. Every discovery reinforced the growing theory that the pair were not only surviving, they were orchestrating the pursuit. An important development came when a constable named Harris discovered a shallow trench partially concealed by reeds. Inside were fragments of clothing consistent with Mariah's attire, a torn hem, a small piece of fabric bearing faint stains. Harris noted the location in his report, emphasizing its significance. It was not simply evidence of passage. It suggested deliberate placement to confuse the hunters. Every small fragment, he reasoned, was a psychological statement, demonstrating both resourcefulness and forethought. Meanwhile, interviews with neighbors and secondary witnesses produced additional details that complicated the narrative. One woman, living near a creek crossing, recalled hearing voices that were neither frantic nor angry but deliberate and controlled, almost as though instructions were being exchanged. Another, a child, claimed to have glimpsed two figures moving together, one significantly larger and stronger than the other, as if coordinating steps. These accounts, though inconsistent in specifics, converged on a clear point. The fugitives were intelligent, careful, and unusually capable of manipulating their environment to their advantage. By late afternoon, the constables and hunters convened to discuss strategy. The pursuit had reached a point where direct confrontation was unlikely without incurring significant risk. Caldwell, recovering but frustrated, argued that they needed to anticipate the fugitives' movements rather than simply react. "They are controlling us," he warned. "Every misstep we make feeds them. We must think as they do." Others advocated for continued linear sweeps, relying on numbers and brute force. The disagreement reflected a larger truth. The psychological component of the chase was now as significant as the physical one. During the evening, a new clue emerged. A set of footprints diverged sharply from the expected path, heading toward an old, abandoned homestead deep within the marsh. The tracks suggested haste, but also careful calculation. The fugitives appeared to have chosen this route to exploit the natural cover of dilapidated structures and dense foliage. Investigators noted that such locations were historically used by escapees to avoid detection, but the precision of the choice indicated more than luck. Mariah and Elias were executing a plan that leveraged both knowledge and experience. Nightfall brought heightened vigilance. Lanterns were lit, torches waved along the edges of creeks, and the sounds of movement, water slapping against reeds, distant branches snapping, were recorded in logs as potential sightings. Constables began mapping these disturbances, trying to correlate them with previous tracks and the layout of the swamp. The challenge was immense. The fugitives were moving through terrain that even experienced trackers found treacherous, turning every small observation into a critical piece of evidence. A particularly striking discovery occurred when one hunter, Greer, located a shallow depression beside a fallen cypress. Inside were remnants of a meal, small bits of bread, traces of water, and a container for carrying supplies. It suggested that Mariah and Elias were sustaining themselves deliberately, rather than simply surviving. More importantly, the location of the supplies indicated that they were aware of the hunters, likely search patterns, and had positioned themselves to avoid immediate detection while maintaining access to essential resources. The growing body of evidence forced authorities to reconsider assumptions. Early on, the fugitives had been treated as desperate, isolated individuals attempting to flee. Now, the emerging patterns suggested strategic planning, adaptability, and a calculated awareness of the hunter's limitations. Each night spent evading capture added to their advantage, creating a feedback loop of uncertainty that frustrated even the most seasoned pursuers. By the second night, the psychological toll was evident. Hunters and constables reported restless sleep, heightened anxiety, and increasing disagreements about tactics. A consensus began to form. The marshland itself, combined with the fugitives' ingenuity, had transformed the pursuit from a physical chase into a battle of wits. Every misjudged step could be exploited, every assumption potentially fatal to the hunter's confidence. At this point, investigators began formalizing the case, documenting inconsistencies, and theorizing about potential outcomes. Some believed the fugitives might split, using deception to mislead pursuers, while others speculated on escape via waterways or hidden paths previously unknown. Every scenario was considered, yet none offered certainty. The day ended with a sobering acknowledgement. Despite extensive manpower, meticulous tracking, and strategic planning, Mariah and Elias had remained elusive. Evidence of their passage, footprints, disturbed foliage, hidden supplies, was abundant, yet direct engagement remained impossible. The investigation had entered a new phase, one in which strategy, observation, and psychological insight would be as important as speed or strength. By the third morning, the swamp had transformed into a theater of shadows and uncertainty. Mist rolled in from the lowlands, settling over the shallow waters and broken underbrush. Lanterns glimmered faintly among the hunters, their beams cutting narrow paths through dense reeds and twisted roots. Exhaustion weighed heavily on both the pursuers and those coordinating the search. Yet the urgency remained, fueled by the fear of failure and the high stakes of capturing two fugitives who had already confounded 12 experienced men. Authorities had now formalized their plan. Hunters were assigned sectors, with each group responsible for carefully documented sweeps. Constables noted tracks, environmental conditions, and potential signs of deception. Evidence was gathered meticulously. Fragments of cloth, discarded provisions, impressions in mud, and even faint marks on tree trunks were catalogued. Yet despite this detailed approach, the elusive figures of Mariah and Elias remained frustratingly absent from direct observation. Throughout the day, conflicting theories circulated. Some argued the pair had split, using diversionary tactics to create confusion. Others contended they were moving in tandem, relying on careful timing and knowledge of natural concealment. Observers noted subtle psychological cues, branches intentionally broken to mislead pursuers, footprints that appeared and disappeared unexpectedly, and disturbances in the water that suggested calculated movement rather than panicked flight. Each new piece of evidence deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. By late afternoon, the hunters had reached an area known locally as the thicket's edge, a dense network of trees and vines notorious for concealing both animals and humans. Here, one of the hunters reported a fleeting glimpse of two figures darting through shadows. The sighting, brief and incomplete, reinforced a growing pattern. Mariah and Elias were not merely escaping, they were orchestrating the engagement, appearing just long enough to influence perception, and then vanishing before capture could occur. As night fell, the constables convened with plantation overseers to review evidence and reassess strategies. Exhaustion and frustration were apparent. Observers noted that even minor errors, misjudging a footstep or assuming a track was recent, could lead to hours of wasted effort. The psychological strain on the hunters was immense. What had begun as a confident pursuit had become a relentless game of patience, observation, and intuition, in which the fugitives held the advantage. Meanwhile, Mariah and Elias had established a temporary refuge, as evidenced by another hidden cache discovered near a natural embankment. Supplies were modest but sufficient: scraps of food, water containers, and rudimentary tools for concealment. Constables noted the significance. These items indicated careful planning and an understanding of both the environment and the hunters' likely behavior. For the first time, it became clear that the pair were operating with a long-term strategy rather than impulsive survival instincts. Over the next several hours, scattered sightings continued, each fleeting and inconclusive. Observers documented the movements meticulously, yet direct engagement remained impossible. Investigators began theorizing about potential escape routes, including river crossings, hidden paths long known only to locals, and temporary concealments within the marsh. Every theory was plausible, yet none offered certainty. By the fourth day, a crucial realization emerged among authorities. The case was no longer a matter of simple capture. It had evolved into a study of human behavior under extreme conditions, of strategy and endurance, and of the limits of authority when faced with intelligence, adaptability, and knowledge of the terrain. 12 hunters, aided by law enforcement, had been outmaneuvered consistently, revealing a profound lesson about underestimating those considered powerless. The final official reports concluded without resolution. Mariah and Elias vanished from the documented trails, leaving behind only traces of their passage: footprints, hidden supplies, and fragments of clothing. Despite extensive investigation, no conclusive sighting or capture was recorded. Authorities acknowledged the case as both confounding and instructive, a rare example of individuals evading a coordinated pursuit through a combination of cunning, resourcefulness, and intimate knowledge of the land. The story remains partially unresolved. Questions linger. Where did Mariah and Elias ultimately go? Did they find permanent refuge, or were they eventually caught elsewhere? And what lessons did the hunters and authorities take away from the experience of being outmaneuvered despite superior numbers and resources? These questions persist, a haunting reminder of the unpredictability of human behavior and the enduring power of ingenuity in the face of oppression. In the archives of Charleston County, the case is recorded with meticulous detail: reports, sketches, witness statements, and evidence logs. Yet the final chapter is left unwritten, allowing the story of Mariah and Elias to endure as a mystery, an enduring testament to resilience, strategy, and the elusive nature of freedom.